The lights of Los Angeles once shimmered with the sound of soul. Somewhere between the glow of Motown and the quiet hum of Capitol Records, a young woman sang with a voice that could melt the air. Her name was Patrice Holloway, a singer who gave her heart to the music long before the world ever learned to say her name. She sang for others, created the voice of television's first black animated character, and wrote songs that made the world move. Yet, somehow, she remained unseen, a legend whose light burned softly behind the spotlight. How does someone so gifted fade into the background of her own story? Let's get into her story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or water, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the flashing lights and studio microphones, there was a small house in Los Angeles where music lived in every corner. On quiet afternoons, the sound of gospel filled the air, voices blending from the Holloway family kitchen to the church down the street. For Patrice Holloway, music wasn't something she learned. It was something she breathed. Born on the 23rd of March 1948, Patrice grew up surrounded by rhythm, faith, and the kind of harmony only a close family could make. Her parents weren't famous, but they understood what a song could do for the soul. Her older sister, Brenda Holloway, had a gift that would soon carry her to Motown. Yet even before Brenda's name appeared on records, Patrice was already finding her own sound softer, deeper, touched with something unexplainably sincere. At church, she could sing both lead and harmony. By the time she was 10, she was already playing guitar, drums, and violin, an unspoken prodigy who didn't yet understand the magnitude of her own ability. Neighbors remembered her as the little girl who sang like she meant it, and that sentiment would follow her for the rest of her life. The Los Angeles of the early 1960 period was alive with possibilities. Teenagers carried transistor radios pressed against their ears, listening to Sam Cooke, The Supremes, and Ray Charles. In that climate, music wasn't just entertainment, it was identity. For a young black girl like Patrice, it was also a way out, a dream worth chasing no matter how far it seemed. The Holloway sisters began writing songs together, sitting on their porch with notebooks and borrowed instruments, creating melodies that reflected both the innocence of youth and the pain of growing up unseen. Their first local release, a modest tune under a small label, gave them a glimpse of what could be. The song didn't chart, but it did something far more important. It introduced them to the tight-knit Los Angeles music circuit, a place where opportunity and heartbreak lived side by side. Soon, the sisters were lending their voices to background sessions for artists who filled jukeboxes across America, Johnny Rivers, Ike Turner, and Sam Cooke among them. Their harmonies were unmistakable, though few knew who they were. It was work that paid little, but every studio session was a step closer to the dream. They recorded under different group names, the 4 J's, the Veneers, and the Bells, leaving a quiet trail of 45 records behind. Each new alias carried a fresh start, another hope that this might be the song that would finally be heard. But for Patrice, the motivation wasn't fame. It was creation the moment the tape started rolling, and the world felt still for 3 minutes of melody. At home, her parents reminded her to stay grounded. Fame, her mother once said, was just noise unless you have something real to say. That lesson shaped Patrice's understanding of music. She wasn't chasing the spotlight. She was chasing truth, the kind that lives in a single voice, stripped of everything but honesty. When Brenda signed to Motown Records in 1964 and scored a national hit with Every Little Bit Hurts, Patrice celebrated like it was her own success. She knew what it meant. The dream was real. Yet even as her sister toured the country, Patrice stayed behind, writing songs and rehearsing with the same quiet determination. She was young, gifted, and patient, qualities that would define both her artistry and her tragedy. Friends would later recall that Patrice never envied her sister. She wanted to build her own path, even if it took longer. By the time she entered her late teens, Patrice had developed a voice rich with emotion, a blend of gospel depth and pop sweetness. It carried the sound of a girl who had seen too much of life's imbalance and turned it into grace. Producers who heard her sing said she sounded older than her years, as if she carried the echoes of another time. Before she ever walked into a major studio, Patrice had already shaped her philosophy. Sing like no one's watching because someday they won't be. It wasn't bitterness, it was foresight, the quiet wisdom of someone who understood that music doesn't always promise glory. Those early years in Los Angeles molded her spirit, half faith, half fire. Surrounded by a city that dreamed big but often forgot its dreamers, she learned that the true measure of an artist wasn't applause, but endurance. And somewhere in that mix of church choirs, late-night radio, and sisterly harmonies, Patrice Holloway was becoming the woman she was destined to be, a voice strong enough to be heard, even when the world chose not to listen. By the mid-1960 period, Patrice Holloway was ready to step beyond background vocals and family harmonies. The girl who once sang in church pews now found herself walking through the studio doors of Motown, the label that had turned ordinary voices into living legends. Her sister Brenda Holloway had already become a star with Every Little Bit Hurts, and it was only natural that the company would take notice of the younger Holloway's talent. Patrice's first single, a bright and heartfelt tune called Stevie, was a musical love letter to Stevie Wonder, a playful, melodic tribute to an artist she admired. Released through Motown's sub-label VIP Records, the song carried the spirit of optimism that defined the era. But in the crowded halls of Motown, even Brilliance could be overlooked. Despite her clear tone and magnetic presence, her sessions were quietly canceled before the year ended. It wasn't talent that held her back, it was timing. Motown in that moment was overflowing with stars: Diana Ross, Smokey Robinson, Marvin Gaye. There wasn't much room for another young woman with a soulful heart and a quiet voice. So, in late 1965, her contract was dropped. She was barely 17, standing outside the empire she once dreamed of joining. For many, that would have been the end. But for Patrice, it was the beginning of something different, a path shaped not by fame, but by persistence. Within a year, she signed with Capitol Records, a label known for its polished pop sound and grand recording studios perched high above Hollywood. Capitol saw what Motown didn't: a voice with warmth and texture, capable of crossing boundaries. Her first release for Capitol, Stolen Hours, was produced by Billy and Gene Page, two brothers who understood the rhythm of radio but also respected the soul of their artist. The song carried an irresistible groove, part pop, part R&B, with Patrice's voice gliding effortlessly through the melody. It was a record built for the charts, but once again, it slipped quietly beneath them. The single found small success in Southern California, a few spins on local radio stations, and admiration from those who heard it, but never the breakthrough she deserved. Undeterred, she returned to the studio for another attempt. Love and Desire, released in 1967, captured something deeper, a young woman's longing wrapped in layers of rhythm and emotion. But when that too failed to reach national attention, Capitol made a decision. They replaced the Page brothers with one of their top producers, David Axelrod. The result was the haunting Stay With Your Own Kind, a song about love and race, brave and unapologetic in its message. Know the joy, she sang, her voice floating between protest and prayer. It was too bold for American radio at the time, but it struck a chord across the Atlantic. Years later, British audiences would rediscover these songs, spinning them in all-night northern soul clubs, where Patrice Holloway's voice would finally get the applause it had long deserved. In the United States, however, silence followed. Capitol ended her solo sessions, keeping her on as a background vocalist. For Patrice, it was a quiet kind of heartbreak to be so close to the dream and still be unseen. Yet even then, she didn't stop singing. She once told a friend, "Music doesn't owe me fame. It just owes me a chance to sing." And sing she did through every closed door, through every song that never made the charts, carrying a faith that someday, someone would listen. The silence after her last Capitol session felt heavier than any applause she had ever known. Patrice Holloway had sung her heart into microphones that never gave her echo back. But Los Angeles had a way of calling its dreamers again, sometimes in the most unexpected forms. By 1970, the city was changing. Motown had moved west, pop was blending with television, and music was no longer confined to records. Somewhere inside Capitol Records, a new idea was forming, a project that would mix bubblegum pop with animation, based on Archie Comics' Josie and the Pussycats. It was meant to be fun, bright, and innocent. But for Patrice, it would become something far more profound. When producers searched for a voice to bring life to Valerie Brown, the show's fictional bassist and the first black female animated character on American television, They needed someone who could sound both powerful and warm, a voice that carried joy, soul, and truth. Patrice walked into the audition, sang just a few lines, and the room fell silent. One of the producers would later recall, "It wasn't just her tone, it was the way she made you feel." At last, she was heard. The studio brought in Cheryl Stoppelmoor, who years later would find fame as Cheryl Ladd on Charlie's Angels, to join the group as one of the other Pussycats. Together, they recorded an entire album under the Capitol label, backed by some of Los Angeles's finest session musicians, including Hal Blaine on drums and Wilton Felder on bass. The result was vibrant, soulful, and alive, a perfect blend of pop innocence and Motown depth. When Josie and the Pussycats aired on Saturday mornings, Patrice Holloway's voice filled living rooms across America. Millions of children sang along to the theme song, never knowing the woman behind it. Yet, for the first time, a black girl could turn on her television and see someone who looked like her and hear a voice that sounded like home. It was a quiet revolution wrapped in a cartoon melody. The album itself, however, didn't receive the same love. Poor promotion and label politics buried it before it had the chance to shine. Within months, the fictional band broke apart, and Patrice's moment under the light faded once again. But this time, she had made history, even if the world didn't notice. After the show's end, producer Danny Jansen saw something special in her and convinced Capitol to keep her on as a solo act. Under his direction, she recorded Evidence, a song that pulsed with conviction and style, and later Black Mother Goose, a bold, creative blend of R&B and storytelling. Yet fate repeated itself. Both projects were shelved, with Black Mother Goose never reaching beyond its promotional pressings. Still, Patrice never let bitterness take root. To those who worked with her, she remained kind, radiant, and professional, a woman who carried both grace and grit. She understood something few artists ever do. Sometimes the reward isn't in recognition, but in the act of creation itself. Her turning point wasn't fame, it was freedom. The freedom to keep singing, even if the world wasn't listening. And somewhere between those studio walls and the laughter of Saturday mornings, Patrice Holloway had already become what she was meant to be, the soulful voice behind the spotlight. For a brief and beautiful moment, the world finally heard Patrice Holloway. It wasn't on a grand stage or through a gold record, but through the sound of her own laughter woven into a Saturday morning song. Josie and the Pussycats became an instant part of pop culture, catchy, colorful, and full of life. Behind the animation and bright costumes, it was Patrice's voice that gave the music its pulse. Children across America sang along to the chorus. Her harmonies danced between joy and fire, giving the fictional band a heartbeat that no cartoon could fake. The series was playful, but her vocals carried something more, a sense of authenticity, a warmth that made it feel real. For the first time, a young black girl could turn on her television and see someone who looked like her singing with confidence and grace. Patrice didn't appear on screen, but she didn't need to. Her sound did the work for her. Through her music, she gave a voice to those who were rarely seen or heard in mainstream television. Valerie Brown, the character she embodied, became the first black animated heroine in American TV history. And behind her, somewhere in a Los Angeles recording booth, Patrice was quietly making history too. In the studio, she was surrounded by legends. Drummer Hal Blaine, bassist Wilton Felder, and other members of the legendary Wrecking Crew filled the room with rhythm. But when Patrice stepped up to the mic, everything seemed to slow down. Engineers would later describe her sessions as effortless one take, pure soul. There was no need to correct her pitch, no need to push for emotion. It was already there, flowing through every note. For the first time, she was part of something that felt larger than herself, a cultural moment that bridged music, television, and identity. When Capitol Records released the Josie and the Pussycats album, it was more than a soundtrack. It was a symbol of a changing America. Even if few realized it, the ground had shifted. Outside the studio, Patrice carried herself with quiet pride. She wasn't chasing celebrity. She enjoyed being part of a creative community, working with people who understood her craft. Her laughter was said to light up the room, the same light that now filled millions of homes through her songs. For once, she wasn't behind someone else's spotlight. She was its very essence. Still, fame remained an echo always close. never lasting. The show had brought her recognition but not stability. Capitol, uncertain how to market a black female artist with a voice that didn't fit neatly into pop or soul categories, began to drift away from her. But for those few months, Patrice Holloway lived inside the dream, singing, recording, and being exactly where her heart belonged. It wasn't fame that defined her peak. It was the truth that, for once, the world had paused long enough to listen. And in that brief silence between notes, Patrice Holloway's voice, rich, human, and unforgettable, finally stood at the center of the sound. The applause never came, at least not in the way it should have. When Josie and the Pussycats ended, the world simply moved on as if the voice that had carried its heart never existed. Patrice Holloway watched as the show that had given her meaning vanished from television screens, leaving behind only the faint echo of its theme song. Capitol Records, unsure how to market her talent, hesitated to invest in a future they didn't fully understand. Patrice returned to the same studio halls that had once felt electric, but now they were quiet, the lights dimmer, the phone ringing less often. She still sang, but the purpose had changed. It was no longer about chasing dreams. It was about holding on to them. In 1971, producer Danny Jansen, who had believed in her during the Pussycats project, convinced Capitol to let her record as a solo artist once more. The song was Evidence, a rich, emotional blend of rhythm and conviction that showcased her range and soul. It should have been her comeback, a moment to remind the world who she was. But promotion was scarce, and radio stations barely noticed. The single faded quietly, lost among the louder trends of the time. A year later, she recorded Black Mother Goose, an album of imaginative, deeply personal material that mixed soul, storytelling, and social reflection. It was unlike anything Capitol had ever produced. Yet before it could be released, the label shelved it indefinitely. Boxes of her tapes sat untouched, collecting dust in storage rooms where dreams went to sleep. For Patrice, it was more than disappointment, it was invisibility. She had the talent, the work ethic, and the legacy of Motown running through her veins. But in an era that often limited black female artists to narrow expectations, she didn't fit the mold. Her voice was too soulful for pop, too melodic for R&B, too human for a business that demanded predictability. Friends later said she handled rejection with grace. She didn't complain or curse her luck. Instead, she poured her heart into other people's music, singing backup, arranging harmonies, and writing songs that would carry other names to fame. When she wasn't in the studio, she returned to her roots, the gospel choir, the church harmonies that had raised her. There, she found peace. There, she wasn't a forgotten name, she was simply a voice among voices, praising something bigger than fame. Yet the industry's silence left its mark. Those who saw her during this period noticed a quiet sadness behind her smile, the kind that only artists know when the world stops listening. She once said softly to a friend, "Maybe my songs weren't meant for the radio. Maybe they were meant for the people who still believe in something real." By the end of the early 1970 period, her name had nearly vanished from the charts, but not from the hearts of those who truly heard her. It was the start of a long fade, not from talent, but from a world that didn't know how to see her light. When the cameras stopped rolling and the records stopped spinning, Patrice Holloway was left with silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes after applause, it was the kind that lingers, heavy and endless. For the first time since she was a child, there were no studios calling, no songs waiting to be recorded. Still, she couldn't let go of the music. It was the one constant in her life, the only thing that made sense when the world no longer did. She began working quietly as a session singer, her name hidden behind the liner notes of other people's success. In 1968, her voice could be heard uncredited on Joe Cocker's powerful rendition of "With a Little Help from My Friends." Her harmonies lifted the song into gospel-like transcendence, yet few knew she was there. For the next few years, she continued lending her talent to other artists, Neil Young, Billy Preston, Delaney, and Bonnie, adding soul to records that would sell millions. She was everywhere and nowhere all at once. During that same time, she joined a collective of gospel singers known as the Brothers and Sisters of Los Angeles, alongside Mary Clayton, Edna Wright, and Clyde King. Together they recorded gospel, according to the Beatles, turning rock anthems into hymns. It was healing work, not glamorous, not famous, but honest. Those who knew her said that Patrice seemed at peace when she sang gospel. It reminded her of home, of the small church where she and Brenda first learned to sing in harmony. In those sessions, she wasn't forgotten. She was family again. But beneath that peace was exhaustion. Years of disappointment had taken their toll. Capitol had moved on. Motown had changed. The music world she once dreamed of belonging to no longer looked like the one she had entered as a teenager. Still, she kept showing up to studios, to rehearsals, to life. Her resilience was quiet, but it was powerful. When she sang, it wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about surviving. There were moments of light even in those darker years. In 1969, a song she had co-written with her sister Brenda, "You Made Me So Very Happy," became an international hit when covered by Blood, Sweat, and Tears. It sold over 1 million copies and earned the Holloway sisters a Grammy nomination. It was a bittersweet victory success wrapped in someone else's voice. She didn't complain. When asked about it later, Patrice simply smiled and said, "I'm just happy people are still singing something I wrote." But privately, the weight of being overlooked began to press harder. Illnesses came and went mysteriously, leaving her weak and drained. Doctors could never quite explain what was wrong. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was heartbreak. In the quiet moments, when the city outside her window hummed with traffic and dreams, she would hum too softly to herself. Because even when the world went silent, Patrice Holloway still had a song left to sing. By the mid-1970 period, Patrice Holloway had quietly become one of those artists whose work lived on in other people's voices. Her name no longer appeared on marquee lights or album covers, but her sound remained buried in harmonies, tucked between the verses of hits that filled radio airwaves. For many, she was invisible. But for those who listened closely, her voice was still there, steady, soulful, unforgettable. Even as her solo dreams faded, Patrice continued to build a quiet legacy. She worked as a songwriter and arranger, contributing to movie soundtracks and sessions that defined an era. Her song "Let's Go Back to Day One" found its way onto the soundtrack of Diana Ross's 1975 film Mahogany, bringing her voice once again into Hollywood's orbit even if it went unrecognized. She had learned how to navigate disappointment with grace. When doors closed, she found a window, a new collaboration, a background part, a line of melody that someone else could carry forward. Her resilience became its own kind of artistry. But the years of constant struggle left their marks. She was often tired, her energy unpredictable, her health fragile. Friends noticed that some days she seemed radiant, glowing with her old spark, and other days she would disappear for weeks at a time. She battled what she called a mysterious illness, one that came and went without warning, like the music industry's affection. In a time when most singers chased recognition, Patrice chased peace. She spent more time writing, sometimes teaching, sometimes simply sitting at her piano, playing songs no one would ever hear. There was something sacred in that, the act of creating without expectation, of giving her gift even when the world wasn't watching. Her sister Brenda Holloway remained a constant presence, a reminder of where it all began. The two would still sing together occasionally, laughing like they once did as teenagers on their porch in Los Angeles. Music had been their bond, and it still was. Yet as the years passed, Hollywood forgot. Motown had entered its nostalgic phase, celebrating its past icons, but Patrice's name was rarely mentioned. When her songs resurfaced in the northern soul scene in Britain, she didn't even know at first. Across the ocean, young fans were dancing to her records, calling her the lost voice of Capitol. To them, she was legendary. To America, she was still missing. By the early 2000 period, her health worsened. Friends described her as kind and gentle to the end, someone who never spoke bitterly about what could have been. She believed every song she sang had a purpose, even if it wasn't hers to see. On the 2nd of October 2006, Patrice Holloway passed away from a heart attack at the age of 58. The news barely made headlines, but among musicians, the silence that followed was deafening. Those who had sung beside her, those who had once heard her voice in the studio, all said the same thing: she should have been remembered. And maybe that's what makes her story so haunting, the idea that the world never gave her flowers while she was here, yet her music still blooms quietly, decades later, in the hearts of those who finally learn to listen. Time has a way of finding the truth even when it takes decades to do so. For Patrice Holloway, the recognition she never received in life began to quietly unfold long after she was gone. In the dim-lit clubs of northern England, where the heartbeat of northern soul still echoed through vinyl and sweat, her songs found resurrection. Records like Stolen Hours, Love and Desire, and Stay With Your Own Kind became prized anthems in the British dance circuit. DJs spun them for crowds who didn't know her story, only that the voice behind those records carried something real, a pulse of honesty that made you move, made you feel. To them, she wasn't forgotten, she was discovered. Across the Atlantic, American collectors began to trace the origins of those rare 45 seconds, realizing that the same woman who gave voice to Josie and the Pussycats had also crafted some of the most powerful, overlooked soul records of her generation. Online forums and fan archives started sharing her music, unearthing her story one record at a time. Each rediscovery was an act of remembrance, a way of restoring her to the legacy she had helped build. Patrice's impact stretched beyond her voice. She had broken a cultural barrier that few even recognized at the time. The first black female character on American television, Valerie Brown, existed because Patrice Holloway refused to let the studio whitewash the cast. When the original plan was to remove the character, she stood her ground, saying she wouldn't sing for the project unless the character remained black. Her insistence wasn't loud, but it was powerful, and it changed history. In that moment, she did what many only dream of. She used her art to make space for others. You can still hear her influence in the artists who followed. The soulful vulnerability of her voice, smooth yet defiant, would echo in generations of singers who blurred the line between pop and soul. From the 1980 period divas who owned MTV to the R&B revivalists of the modern day. They might not all know her name, but they walk through doors she helped open. Her legacy also lives in the sisterhood she shared with Brenda Holloway. Together, their songwriting bridged gospel purity and commercial soul proof that faith and artistry could coexist. Songs like You Made Me So Very Happy continue to be performed around the world, carrying her melody far beyond the limits of her lifetime. And then there's Josie and the Pussycats, a series many remember with nostalgic joy, unaware that its theme song carries the soul of a woman who changed television forever. Her voice is still there, preserved in those few minutes of music, bright and alive, echoing through generations of Saturday mornings. For every artist who has ever been overlooked, Patrice Holloway stands as both warning and inspiration, a reminder that greatness doesn't depend on spotlight or fame. It depends on the truth inside the work. She didn't need a star on Hollywood Boulevard. Her legacy lives in the notes that never stopped playing and in the people who, at long last, began to listen. In America, rediscovery often happens in whispers. For Patrice Holloway, those whispers began to grow louder as decades passed. Musicians, archivists, and lovers of classic soul started asking the same question: how did we overlook her? As documentaries and retrospectives revisited the history of Motown and Capitol Records, her name began to surface again, not as a footnote, but as a missing chapter. Interviews with her peers painted a picture of a woman who was far more than a singer. She was an innovator, a quiet force who carried both gospel heart and Hollywood finesse. In university classrooms and music archives, her recordings are now studied as examples of crossover soul songs that bridged the sacred and the secular, the American and the global. Stay With Your Own Kind, once too provocative for its time, is now recognized as a social statement ahead of its era, a fearless piece of art cloaked in melody. For younger generations of artists, Patrice's journey speaks to a timeless truth that talent doesn't always lead to recognition, but legacy doesn't always need fame to endure. There's a beauty in the stories that almost slipped away, and hers is one of them. The British Northern Soul community has continued to honor her music through dance floors and record fairs. Every time a DJ drops the needle on Stolen Hours or Love and Desire, there's a quiet sense of reverence, not just for the beat, but for the woman behind it. These fans, most of whom were born after her songs were recorded, became her most loyal audience. They kept her voice alive when America forgot. And then, slowly, America remembered. Television retrospectives about representation began to highlight Josie and the Pussycats, acknowledging its groundbreaking impact. For the first time, critics credited Patrice Holloway not only as a singer but as a pioneer, the woman who gave life and dignity to Valerie Brown, television's first black animated heroine. For black women in entertainment, her courage resonates deeply. She proved that quiet resistance, the kind that doesn't seek headlines, can still shape culture in ways that last. Her decision to stand her ground against the studio's attempt to erase a black character might seem small to some, but for generations of artists who came after, it was everything. Today, you can find her name in digital archives, rediscovered albums, and tribute playlists that celebrate voices history forgot. She may have been unseen in her lifetime, but her voice, recorded on fragile vinyl and magnetic tape, endures in the age of streaming, a timeless reminder that truth always finds its way home. In many ways, her story mirrors the soul of America itself, flawed, striving, rediscovering its conscience through art. Patrice Holloway's legacy isn't just about what she sang. It's about what she stood for: grace without recognition, conviction without applause. The world may not have built her a monument, but every time her song plays, it feels like one. The lights of Los Angeles have dimmed many times since Patrice Holloway last walked its studio halls. But if you listen closely late at night, when the city grows quiet, you can almost hear her voice floating through the air, carried by memory and melody. The same voice that once gave life to a cartoon, that once turned sorrow into song, still lingers somewhere between the speakers and the soul. Her story isn't about failure. It's about endurance, about a woman who kept singing, even when no one was listening. She lived through the glory and the silence, through the applause that never came, and through the years that forgot her name. Yet what she left behind is something no award could measure: a sound that refuses to die. Every note she sang came from truth, not from ambition, but from faith. Faith that the music would outlive the moment, and it did. Decades later, her voice still rises from old records, from reruns of Josie and the Pussycats, from the rare Northern Soul compilations where she's finally credited as she always should have been. In the end, that's what makes her legacy powerful. She may have been overshadowed by time, but she was never erased. Because voices like hers, honest, unpolished, deeply human, have a way of echoing long after fame fades away. For every artist who's ever been forgotten, Patrice Holloway stands as a reminder: greatness doesn't always come with recognition. Sometimes it comes with resilience. So the next time you hear that familiar chorus, Josie and the Pussycats, remember the woman who sang it. Remember the girl from Los Angeles who carried Motown in her heart and soul in her breath. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Patrice Holloway the respect she truly deserved? If her story moved you, take a moment to honor her now. Leave a message in the comments. Share her name. Keep her light alive. Because the world forgot, but we remember.